Hello, I'm UK Airgunner, and this is the 1911 versus the P.08 Luger. Yes, well, or more specifically, I suppose, this is the airgun versions of the 1911 versus the P.08. Now, of course, both of these airguns are made by KWC, even though this one is branded by Remington, obviously, but they are both the .177, that's 4.5mm steel BB versions of these airguns, so they're not airsoft, so they're made by the same company, and they're in the same caliber, so they are very similar, and they have the same, they both use CO2 as well, so very similar in some ways, but also obviously very dissimilar in other ways. So I'm going to be comparing these two today, comparing them as air guns, but also I might give you a bit of brief history as they actually compared in real life as well. So let's start with how they actually feel. That's rather important. The contours of the grips are surprisingly different, and although in fact the Luger might look more comfortable, more ergonomic perhaps, I actually find it not quite as comfortable. I'm not entirely sure why, I can't explain it. You do get a good grip on it, obviously, you can see, but there's something just not quite as comfortable. I don't know, I think the grip might be a little bit bigger, that might be part of it. The 1911 just seems to fit like a glove for me. Obviously, mind you, if you haven't already seen my earlier videos with these airguns, I have weathered both of these airguns slightly, that's why the edges look slightly more shiny, and the finish isn't quite as perfect, I suppose, and the grips as well. Placed both of the grips on these airguns to real wooden grips. But that changes very little. In fact, they're even less comfortable, both of them, with the original grips on the plastic ones. So yeah, so the grips, I find the 1911 more comfortable to hold, and obviously this is something you, if possible, you should do, is try and get a hold of the air guns, go down to a local airgun dealer, and hopefully they'll allow you to handle the guns, the air guns, before you buy them, which is what I do. So yeah, the grips, comfortable. They are comfortable on both, but I'd probably have to go to the 1911 is more comfortable. In terms of how they function, I'm going to take out the magazines out of both of them. Stick them here. So how they function is obviously probably where they differ most. The 1911 is your classic slide operated pistol. So if I take the safety off, pull back, slide, and I can lock that back. So that is a very familiar sight nowadays, the slide operated pistol. So essentially what happens when you pull the trigger, I need to hold down the grip safety there, when you pull the trigger, the hammer releases and hits the CO2 valve and releases a lot of CO2 inside here, and that blows back the entire slide like that. Meanwhile, the BB, of course, is flying down the barrel and off towards the target, and then the springs inside push back the slide forwards, and that picks up the next BB and loads it into the chamber or the barrel, and then you're ready to go again because the slide has also recocked the hammer, so the trigger is now ready to go again. So that's how this one functions, and of course that is how the real thing functions. Whilst the Luger is slightly different. So once again, I need to, well, yeah, take the safety off. I don't think you, no, you don't actually need to take the safety off to function this one. So this one, when you pull the trigger, there's an internal hammer in this airgun, and when you pull the trigger, that internal hammer is released, pings up and hits the CO2 valve as with the 1911. But instead of sort of a whole slide sort of thing and all that malarkey, this is a lot more complicated. You've got this toggle system which is blown back instead, and that goes up, and it works, I suppose, very much in the same sort of way, only it's a very different mechanism. So that blows back, the BB flies down the barrel, this blows back, giving you a nice jolt, and then as it comes back down, it picks up the next BB and loads it in the chamber. But at the same time as this is going up, it recocks that internal hammer. So I suppose you could say they are actually very similar, but so they do the same thing, but very differently. This one's got a huge long slide, this one's got a funky toggle mechanism instead. That is, but they essentially function in the same way, I suppose. So that's cool. Now, as we've taken the magazines out, we may as well have a look at them. Once again, in design, I suppose they are very similar. They've both got the CO2 valves on the back there. They both hold the CO2. They're both full-size metal dropout magazines. Both hold roughly the same amount of BBs. I can't remember. It's around 20 BBs, I seem to remember. They are both very realistic as well. I'll talk a little bit more about realism, but they are both detailed in a way that resembles the real versions of the magazines, which is always good with these replica airguns, of course. So that's pretty cool. Now, going back to the actual airguns themselves, what are the triggers like? Well, the triggers are, of course, an essential part of shooting accurately. The trigger is probably, well, I think the trigger's best on the 1911. The 1911 has got the best trigger, I think. 1911 in the real world is renowned for its good triggers because it was always a single action. So because all the mechanism is already cocked, you've only got to pull the trigger and it doesn't have to do much except release the hammer. So consequently, most 1911s have quite nice triggers. And also with this one, you've got some sort of knurling on the hammer. Got some knurling on the hammer as well, but on the trigger, and it's quite a nice sort of thin trigger, which I like. And you can get the pad of your finger on there, and it feels quite comfortable. So I prefer it on the 1911. Looking at the Luger, the pull isn't quite as crisp and clean. Partly because if you've seen my first video, the review of this airgun, you've seen that the trigger action, I suppose, is transferred between a lot of different components all around here. And I think that sort of dulls down the way that the trigger feels. It doesn't feel as solid. It feels a little bit, I don't know, iffy. So not as a nice pull, and it's a very wide trigger compared with the 1911 as well. I don't know if you can really tell that, but it's almost, I'd say, at least 1.5 times the width of the 1911's trigger. And partly because of the grip, it's a little bit more difficult for me personally. I've got to sort of twist my hand around a bit. So you should hold it kind of like that. But for me, I've got to twist my hand just around a little bit so that I can get the pad of my finger on that trigger comfortably. So that's another little thing, but obviously it depends on the size of your hand, and that's what I'm saying. You should probably go and handle these airguns before purchasing them, unless you're just interested, as I was, in the actual fact that it's a Luger and a 1911, of course. So controls, I suppose we should have a look at the controls. Flip this one over. So basically that's the safety and the slide locks and things. Safeties are, well, they're both on the back. Now let's put them, for the 1911 the safety is up. That means it's on safe. With the P.08 Luger, it's on safe if it's down. So they're opposite in that sort of regard. With the 1911, the safety is very easy to engage and disengage without really needing to change your grip on the airgun. Whereas the P.08 Luger is not quite, because it's all the way back here on your knuckle in effect. So to knock off the safety, you've got to really reach back and then reacquire your grip. It's not quite as smooth, should we say, as the 1911, but it's still fairly quick and easy once you get used to it. And then slide lock, obviously the 1911 has a slide lock so that you can pull back the slide, lock it, and well, yeah, then you can load in your next magazine. And obviously after the magazine ends, the slide locks back anyway. And the same can be said for the P.08 Luger, only you can't do it manually. So yes, the toggle locks back when your magazine runs out of BBs, but if you want to just do it, you know, now, for example, you can't really, unless you've got an empty magazine. You can, of course, put that in, pull the toggle, and it then locks back because that magazine is empty. That's one way to do it. Or the sort of slightly less technical way of doing it is by pulling back the toggle, and then you probably won't see it because it's quite deep, but there's a little arm in there which you can lift up, and you're effectively making your finger do what the little button here does, which is to pull up. There's a little arm in there which locks back the toggle when it's pulled back. So you can do it in that sort of less technical way. So yeah, so that's that. And then having a look at the sights are fairly different, but not all that dissimilar. Of course, these are both fixed iron sights, so you can't adjust them, which is a little bit of a problem for me on the P.08 Luger, mainly because I've discovered, and I think again I mentioned this in the review, that my one tends to shoot a little bit low left, which is slightly annoying. Whereas the 1911 for me shoots pretty much dead on, so it's a little bit easier to hit well with the 1911 than it is with the P.08 for me. Of course, it's unlikely that you'll have exactly the same problem with your P.08 if you got one, and maybe your 1911 wouldn't be completely absolutely on. But all that is just holding where you need to hold in order to hit the target where you want to, and then they're almost as accurate. They are very similar in terms of accuracy, and I think they've got more or less the same sort of barrel lengths and everything, so not a lot of difference there. But personally, for me, because of the fact the Luger shoots low left, I tend to hit more accurately with the 1911. So let's move on to realism. These are, of course, replicas of real firearms, and part of the reason of getting these really is because they are replicas. So how close are they to the real things? Well, I've mentioned about the magazines and the fact they've got these sort of little details which are very close and make it look even more like the real magazines, apart from the fact that, of course, you've got the massive CO2 cartridge in there. But they haven't done too bad a job, and the fact that they're full-size metal dropout as well is always good. And then in terms of the actual field strip, we'll do the 1911 first. They've got, both airguns have got their detractors in the takedown. That's not quite true. Now with the real 1911, what you would actually do first is you'd push in this button on the front. You push that in, you turn this and pull this out, and then this button would actually come out on the spring, and that would relieve all the tension inside there, because that is this button is on the recoil spring, if you like. So all the tension will be released from that spring, and it makes it a lot easier to then just slide the slide back and push out the slide lock. But this replica, this airgun, does not do that. So you've still got to pull it back. Of course, the recoil spring in this is nowhere near as strong as the real thing, but even so. So, and the reason for that is you can see here that there's a lip all the way around that button on the back. That's why it doesn't come out the front. And I'd imagine that's probably because, from a safety point of view, there's a lot of force going into that, and it's probably safer and it's going to last longer if they've got that piece, that little rim around there. So anyways, apart from that, I think it's more or less almost identical to the 1911. So there's that button, has to come out the back instead of the front. And there's the barrel. The barrel is slightly different, but once again very close. It hasn't got the drop link system in here, it's got this instead. But it has got the 2 lugs, and you know, it's very close to the real thing. Of course, it's got the 45 ACP fake barrel, recessed barrel, and then you can see the, hopefully, just about see, yeah, there it is, the brass barrel inside. But the way that this moves, that's realistic. That's quite good. Just another thing, if you haven't watched the review on this, this spring does go on a specific way around. So you see how it goes on loosely that way around, and there's a little bit of resistance when you're putting it this way around. It needs to go on that way first. And then the actual slide itself, the front half is more or less identical, because you've got where there's 2 lugs lock up at the front there. But this bit at the back obviously is not quite right, because this is the CO2 valve, the blowback valve. And all you'd have here really is just your firing pin mechanism and your firing pin block and that sort of thing. So it's fairly close, and I commend KWC for doing so well with this. Right, put it back together. Yes. So you see, in effect, what it should look like is something like that, and then this piece would go on the front and then down in there, but yeah, can't do that, so you have to do it the other way around. Oops. Put the button back in first, and then the spring. There we go. Okay, nice. And we can put that back on there. Okay. So that's the slide back together. Now, as far as the frame, or the lower, or the grip, or whatever you want to call it, is concerned, I don't know how close that is. I'd imagine it's fairly close, as far as you can see it. But obviously, disassembling this is beyond the field strip, so yeah, I don't know about that. And then it slides back on. Oh, yes, don't forget to push this little button down. Or you can just slam it back really hard, and that'll probably do the same thing. But yeah, that's pretty close on to the real deal. The fact that my safety engages when the hammer's down or not cocked is not realistic. I don't know if that's just my airgun or not, but there we are. Okay, so that's the takedown, the field strip of the 1911. Now, as far as the P.08 is concerned, you need a little tool, and I haven't got one with me at the moment, to actually disassemble the toggle. But I'll take it as far apart as I can. So you need to hold back the upper, the slide, not the slide, the upper, I'm going to call it the upper, and then pull down the takedown lever here, and then you can move this piece, which is just like the real thing. Oop, and it needs to be on fire, I forgot. And then the upper and the lower separate quite nicely. So there we have it. And then the next thing to do would be to push out this pin. So you push out from this side, the smaller bit in the middle, and it comes out here. And that's just like the real thing. And then the way that the rest of it disassembles, as far as the toggle is concerned, is very similar as well. What's not quite realistic is the fact that the inner barrel comes back with the toggle, because obviously the real thing doesn't have an inner barrel, it just has a barrel, whereas this one, of course, you've got the fake barrel and the internal 4.5mm barrel. And as well, whilst we've got it apart, you can see the internal hammer, where this sort of little brass roller is, that is the internal hammer down there. So when you pull the trigger, it pulls this little piece in here, that goes inwards and releases this hammer, which flies forwards and knocks this little piece here. This is like a secondary hammer, which then hits the CO2 valve on the magazine. and then it goes from there. So that's not quite true, because I'm fairly sure I'm right in saying that the real P.08 is in effect a striker-fired gun. So it has a firing pin which just moves forward under spring tension, and there's no actual hammer as such. So let's put that back together, remembering to hold down this piece here to prevent damage to the trigger mechanism. Hold it back, slip this piece back in, and there we go, all back together. Nice. Okay, so that's pretty much them compared, I think. So just a little bit of history, because of course these are replicas, and it's interesting to know, if you don't already, a little bit about their history. So starting with the 1911, of course, this was designed by John Browning, who of course is a very famous, well-known firearms designer. I'm sure you've heard of many other weapons he designed, and of course the 1911 is probably the most famous. I believe he started designing it in the 1890s, and of course it wasn't adopted by the US military until 1911. And then of course it saw service through World War I, World War II, and stayed in service with the US military up until I think the 1980s, or at least when it was replaced by the Beretta M92 FS, or whatever it's called, the Beretta. So this one had quite a long service life, and indeed today of course it's still made in huge numbers by hundreds of companies in all sorts of variations. So this has really lived on. Of course there are different versions of it. This more specifically is the 1911A1, which is the World War II model. It came about in the 1920s, but it's really known for the World War II era. And then the P.08, slightly different sort of backstory. Whereas the 1911 was designed from conception and was one idea from one guy, the P.08 really is a development of an older pistol, which I believe is the C93, which had this sort of similar toggle mechanism, only it sort of came back to about here-ish, and it was just bigger and slightly more complicated and probably less reliable, and then it was taken, developed and improved in the 1890s, and eventually it was adopted by the German army in 1908. Right, P.08. So yeah, adopted by the German army in 1908, but I think it was adopted by the Swiss earlier than that. I'm not sure exactly how much earlier, but I think it was adopted slightly earlier by the Swiss. And used extensively, of course, in World War I and later World War II, but oddly enough, after World War II, they stopped making them. And I think that was pretty much it for the P.08. I don't know, I think some replicas might have been made later on, but really, this was the end of it in World War II. So the 1911 has really lived on, whereas the P.08 has sort of been confined to the history books, and the odd one that's still out there is normally highly expensive, and you probably wouldn't shoot it too much because it's an old gun now. Considering the last ones were made in the 1940s, or maybe even earlier, because of course the P.38 came about and that really replaced this. So that's my, well, it's meant to be short, but it's coming up to 25 minutes, but that's my short little versus video on the 1911 and the P.08. These are of course the airgun versions. Both fantastic pistols, and these of course are action pistols, replica action pistols. Both fantastic backyard shooters, plinking airguns, kind of both starting sort of range, both roughly, well, just over 100 quid perhaps. The Luger is probably slightly more expensive, I think, still, but definitely highly recommend them. Great fun to plink with in the back garden, knocking over targets and that sort of thing. So thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and if you want to see more of my airguns, then please have a look at my Instagram page and follow me. The username is UK_airgunner, or you can click in the link below in the description. Once again, thank you very much for watching. UK Airgunner, out.